In the vast expanse of the African savannah, where golden grass stretches endlessly beneath an unforgiving sun, there exists a creature that most dismiss as ordinary. A lone male lion, scarred and silent, moving through territories with a patience that seems almost inhuman. But silence, as the savannah would soon discover, is not weakness. It is the calm before a storm that would reshape the hierarchy of an entire region. His name was Thorn. The rangers who monitored the Serengeti's northern corridor had given him that name because of a distinctive scar that ran diagonally across his left shoulder, jagged and dark like a thorn embedded in his golden coat. But there was something else about Thorn that made him remarkable, something that went far beyond the physical mark that defined him. He was different from other males. Where lions roared to assert dominance, Thorn remained silent. Where his peers challenged rivals with bellowing declarations that echoed across the plains, Thorn moved like a ghost, present but unseen, powerful but unannounced. For 3 years Thorn had been ridiculed by every coalition he encountered. Young males would circle him, testing his resolve, waiting for the explosive display of aggression that typically defines a male lion's territory. But Thorn never gave them what they expected. He would simply turn and walk away, leaving his challengers confused and frankly insulted. In the world of lions, where dominance is asserted through noise and violence, Thorn's silence was interpreted as submission. His refusal to engage was seen as cowardice. The pride males who ruled the central territories would laugh when rangers spoke of Thorn, dismissing him as a broken lion, a male past his prime, not worth the effort to truly challenge. Other lions in the region had begun to mock him openly. A coalition of 3 younger males, their manes still filling in with the richness of youth, had actually started following Thorn from territory to territory. They would emerge from the grass just behind him, roaring challenges that shook the earth, daring him to turn and fight. When he refused, they would laugh, a sound that carried across the plains like a taunt. The locals called them the 3 princes, for they acted like spoiled offspring of more powerful males, bullies without true courage. But Thorn simply accepted their jeers with the same quiet resignation he offered to everything else. The thing about Thorn that most didn't understand, what the rangers eventually documented and scientists would later study intensely, was that his silence wasn't born from weakness or fear. It was a strategy, a calculated approach to survival in a world where most lions burn themselves out in endless territorial disputes, fighting night after night, accumulating injuries that compound until they become fatal. Thorn had chosen a different path. He had watched his brothers die from infected wounds sustained in pointless battles. He had seen pride males at their peak collapse from exhaustion during the dry season, their bodies weakened by constant conflict when they should have been conserving energy for hunting. He had learned something that his critics had yet to grasp. The savannah respects patience. It punishes arrogance. By day, Thorn would move through the grasslands, hunting with precise efficiency. He killed what he needed to survive, neither more nor less. He drank from water holes when others weren't around, avoiding unnecessary confrontation. He marked his territory in subtle ways that other lions recognized but didn't feel compelled to challenge. His presence was felt rather than announced, a confidence so complete that it required no vocalization. The 3 princes continued their harassment, but as weeks turned to months, something began to shift. They were growing tired of chasing a target who wouldn't engage. Their voices, once sharp and mocking, began to carry a note of frustration. More importantly, the rangers began to notice something unusual in Thorn's behavior. He was positioning himself strategically. His movements followed patterns that suggested careful planning. He would appear at water holes not at dawn or dusk like most lions, but at specific times when prey animals were at their most vulnerable. His hunts became legendary among those who tracked him, so efficient that rangers would sometimes follow his path just to understand how a single male could thrive so completely without the support of a pride. One evening in September, as the dry season began to settle over the Serengeti, a wildlife researcher named Dr. Marcus Webb made an observation that would change everything we thought we understood about Thorn. Webb had been monitoring lion behavior for 11 years, and he prided himself on understanding the species intimately. But Thorn had eluded his complete comprehension until that night. In his field journal, Webb wrote, "There is something profoundly strategic about this male's approach to survival. He is not avoiding conflict because he fears it. He is avoiding it because he understands something the others have not yet learned. Every roar, every territorial display, every act of aggression costs energy. And in this environment, energy is life. He is preparing for something. But what? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected. By October, rumors began to circulate through the ranger stations about unusual activity in the territories surrounding Thorn's range. Buffalo herds that normally migrated through specific corridors had started to shift their patterns. Zebra populations, usually predictable in their seasonal movements, were appearing in unexpected locations, and the hunting efficiency of the three princes had mysteriously declined. They were losing kills that should have been easy, finding themselves outmaneuvered at waterholes by competitors they had previously dominated. Within 3 weeks, 2 of the 3 had been driven from the territory entirely, limping away with injuries that suggested they had encountered something far more formidable than a quiet male who supposedly lacked the courage to fight. The eldest of the 3 princes, the one the rangers called Crown for the distinctive mane pattern on his forehead, remained, but he was wounded, carrying a gash along his flank that suggested he had encountered something with teeth as sharp as his own. When rangers finally captured footage of the confrontation between Crown and Thorn, what they witnessed on the camera trap would become the most studied lion interaction in the history of the Serengeti research program. It showed Thorn, silent as always, approaching Crown at a waterhole at precisely 4:47 in the morning. The footage was grainy, but the sequence of events was unmistakable. There was no roaring, no threatening display. Thorn simply approached, and in less than 8 seconds the interaction was over. Crown was on the ground, and Thorn was walking away, his body language unchanged, his expression unreadable. The entire exchange had taken less time than a heartbeat, yet in those brief seconds, the hierarchy of the entire region had shifted. What made this moment so shocking to the scientific community was not the violence itself. Lions killed each other regularly in territorial disputes. What shocked them was the efficiency, the precision, the complete absence of the ritual that normally preceded such encounters. Thorn had somehow bypassed every evolutionary mechanism designed to prevent deadly conflict. He had fought without theater, without the posturing that normally preceded violence, without giving his opponent a chance to submit and withdraw. It was as if he had transcended the traditional rules of lion society and operated on a plane that others couldn't comprehend. Word spread quickly through the animal communication networks of the savannah. Scent marks began to appear in territories that Thorn had previously left unchallenged. Other males, older and more established, began to take notice. Within 48 hours of the encounter with Crown, Thorn had killed 3 zebras, claimed a territory that had been disputed for months, and established himself as a force that demanded respect. The mocking had stopped, the laughter had ceased. In its place came a new understanding, a recognition that silence might be the most dangerous sound of all. But this was only the beginning. The nightfall that would change everything was still weeks away, and in the darkness before that revelation, the savannah would witness a transformation unlike anything seen before. Thorn was about to prove that his silence had been not surrender, but preparation, not weakness, but the gathering of strength. And when he finally unleashed what had been building for 3 long years, the entire ecosystem of the northern Serengeti would never be the same. Dr. Webb's journal entries from this period reveal a man grappling with the implications of what he was witnessing. October 23rd. Thorn has claimed 4 new territories in 2 weeks. The efficiency with which he has established dominance over these areas suggests a level of strategic planning that I would not have thought possible in a lion. He is not expanding his range through constant battling and patrol marking like other males. He is doing something far more sophisticated. He is eliminating specific rivals, claiming territories when the time is optimal, and moving in patterns that suggest he has somehow calculated the movement of prey animals months in advance. Is this intelligence? Is this learned behavior passed down from an elder? Or is this something else entirely, something we have yet to categorize? As October turned to November and the dry season deepened, Thorn's movements became even more pronounced. He had grown leaner, more muscular, his body honed to a state of predatory perfection. His scars, rather than diminishing his appearance, seemed to enhance it, marking him as a survivor of countless struggles. The rangers could see him more frequently now, no longer hidden in the tall grass, no longer avoiding observation. It was as if he was revealing himself deliberately, allowing the world to see what had been building in the silence. The 3 princes, now reduced to a single member, had retreated to the southern territories. The territories they had claimed, the waterholes they had dominated, the prides they had terrorized, all of it was now under Thorn's control, and he had accomplished this with barely a sound, with barely a confrontation, with nothing but patience and the terrifying efficiency of a hunter who knew exactly what he was doing. The savannah had begun to understand what Thorn had known all along. Sometimes the greatest power lies not in the loudest roar, but in the silence that precedes the storm. And the storm was coming. It was building on the horizon like a gathering of dark clouds before a monsoon. Thorn had positioned himself not just as a territorial male, but as something far more significant. He was preparing for a confrontation that would define his entire existence, a confrontation that would test everything he had learned in those 3 years of silence and solitude. The nightfall was approaching, and when it arrived, the African savannah would witness an event so extraordinary, so brutal, and so completely unprecedented that it would be studied and debated by wildlife experts for generations to come. The week before the nightfall event, Thorn's behavior shifted in ways that even the most experienced rangers found difficult to interpret. He began moving between territories with increasing frequency, traveling distances that should have exhausted him, yet appearing stronger with each passing day. His kills became more elaborate, more calculated. He would take down prey twice the size of what he normally hunted, not for the meat, but it seemed to demonstrate capability, to show the world what he had become. Dr. Webb documented 11 separate kills in 6 days, each one executed with a precision that bordered on surgical, each one positioned strategically in territories where other males would see them, would understand their significance, would begin to grasp the magnitude of the threat that was rising among them. On November 18th, just 3 days before the nightfall that would change everything, Thorn did something that shocked the entire research community. He walked directly into the heart of a rival territory, the domain of a coalition known as the Iron Mane Brotherhood. These were not young males testing their strength. These were established rulers of one of the most productive regions in the entire Serengeti, 3 adult males, each weighing over 450 pounds of pure muscle, each scarred from countless victories, each capable of killing a buffalo without assistance. They had controlled their territory for 5 years, an eternity in lion society. They were considered untouchable. Thorn walked into their domain at midday, when heat drove most predators into shade. He walked slowly, deliberately, his body language calm, but his presence unmistakable. The moment the Iron Mane Brotherhood sensed him, all 3 emerged from their resting spot beneath an enormous acacia tree. The largest of them, identified by rangers as Obsidian for the darkness of his mane, let out a roar that traveled for miles across the savannah. It was a warning, a declaration of ownership, a statement that this territory belonged to him and his coalition, and any intruder would be met with overwhelming force. Thorn stopped. He was perhaps 80 meters from the 3 males. The distance was close enough for confrontation, but far enough to allow retreat. 100 camera traps captured what happened next, because the research stations had by this point become obsessed with documenting Thorn's every movement. What they recorded would become one of the most discussed moments in wildlife behavioral science. Thorn did not roar in return. He did not posture or display aggression. Instead, he simply sat down. Right there in the middle of the plain, visible to all 3 males, he sat down as if he had decided to rest. His calmness was so complete, so utterly serene, that it seemed to confuse the Iron Mane Brotherhood entirely. They had expected a young male, desperate and aggressive. They had expected to be challenged, to have to enforce their dominance through violence. Instead, they were faced with a male who seemed completely indifferent to their presence, completely unconcerned with their threats. Obsidian roared again, this time with what could only be described as frustration in his vocalization. He began to approach Thorn, his gait aggressive, his body tensed for combat. The other 2 males flanked him, creating a coordinated assault formation. This was how coalitions operated, with military precision, overwhelming their opponents through coordinated strategy. The footage shows them advancing, closing the distance from 80 meters to 60, then 50, then 40. At this point, any normal male lion would have fled or prepared to fight. Thorn did neither. He simply sat, watching them approach with eyes that seemed to contain an intelligence no lion should possess. At 30 meters, Thorn stood, not in preparation for combat, but slowly, as if merely acknowledging their presence had become necessary. He stretched, his muscles rippling beneath his coat, displaying physical perfection that the camera captured in stunning detail. Then, without any aggressive display, without any confrontation, Thorn turned and walked away. He walked backward, maintaining eye contact with Obsidian the entire time, never breaking his gaze, never showing fear or submission. He simply walked, steadily and deliberately, back through their territory and out into the neutral grasslands beyond. What happened next shattered everything we thought we understood about lion behavior. The Iron Mane Brotherhood did not chase him. They did not pursue what they perceived as a fleeing rival. Instead, they stopped at their territorial boundary and watched him leave. One of the younger males actually retreated to the acacia tree and lay down, his body language suggesting confusion and disturbance. Dr. Webb, who was monitoring the camera feeds in real time, made a note that would later become famous in behavioral science circles. "I have just witnessed something that should not be possible. A single lion just walked into the territory of a three-male coalition and left on his own terms. More remarkably, the coalition allowed it. They did not fight. They did not pursue. They watched him leave as if they understood, without words, without violence, that pursuing him would result in their deaths." The implications of this encounter rippled through the research community. Thorn had not fought the Iron Mane Brotherhood. He had not needed to. His mere presence, his absolute confidence, his complete lack of fear had been enough to convince three experienced predators that confrontation would be unwise. This was psychological dominance at the highest level. This was a display of power that transcended the physical. In the days following this encounter, the behavior of other males in the region shifted dramatically. The mocking stopped entirely. The casual dismissals of Thorn as a broken or weak lion evaporated. In their place came a new understanding, a recognition that something fundamental had changed in the territorial hierarchy. Thorn was no longer a peripheral figure in the social structure of the Serengeti. He had become the center, the pivot point around which everything else rotated. But Thorn himself remained silent. He did not bask in this newfound recognition. He did not patrol his expanding territory with the typical roaring and marking behavior that established males employed. Instead, he seemed to be waiting for something, preparing for something that the rangers and scientists could not yet comprehend. His movements became even more measured, even more purposeful. He would appear at specific locations at specific times, as if working from a schedule that only he understood. His kills continued, methodical and precise, each one positioning him for something larger, something more significant. November 20th brought the first indication of what Thorn was actually preparing for. A messenger from a neighboring research station arrived with footage that changed everything. While Dr. Webb had been monitoring Thorn's movements in the north, another researcher named Dr. Elena Okafor had been tracking the movements of a completely separate pride in the southern regions. This pride, called the royal bloodline for their particularly impressive genetics and physical specimens, had been in conflict with a nomadic coalition from the east for several months. The conflict had been escalating, with multiple skirmishes leaving members of both groups wounded. What Dr. Okafor's footage showed was that Thorn had somehow positioned himself at the center of this conflict. He had been seen moving through the territories of both groups. He had been observed marking boundaries that seemed designed to separate the combatants. Most remarkably, he had been hunting in patterns that suggested he was deliberately providing food to the royal bloodline's lions, leaving kills in locations where they would find them, positioning them to be stronger for the next confrontation with the nomadic coalition. When Webb and Okafor connected the dots, they realized that Thorn had been engaged in an elaborate game of territorial chess for the past 3 months. He had been systematically positioning himself as a mediator, a power broker, someone whose influence could determine the outcome of disputes between other groups. This was a level of strategic sophistication that had never been documented in wild lions before. This was politics, pure and simple. This was an animal operating at the highest levels of social manipulation. The night of November 21st was when things truly accelerated. Thorn appeared simultaneously at 3 different locations within a span of 4 hours, an impossibility that suggested either multiple camera errors or something so significant that the research teams didn't yet have framework to understand it. At 6:47 p.m., Thorn was recorded at the northern boundary of his claimed territory. At 8:23 p.m., he was documented in the central region near a major waterhole. At 10:15 p.m., camera traps captured him at the southern edge of territories controlled by the royal bloodline. The timestamps were verified multiple times. The footage was enhanced and analyzed from every angle. There was no doubt that this was the same lion, identifiable by his distinctive scar and the unique pattern of his mane. Somehow, impossibly, Thorn had traveled between these locations in time frames that should have been impossible for any animal. The research teams began to wonder if they were witnessing something beyond normal lion behavior, something that suggested an intelligence or capability that fundamentally challenged their understanding of the species. As midnight approached on November 21st, the sky over the Serengeti seemed to darken in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of moonlight. The clouds gathered unnaturally, moving in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sense of distant territories, mixing the markers and signals that different groups of lions used to communicate with one another. It was as if the savannah itself was preparing for something catastrophic. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., Thorn released a roar. Not the territorial roar that males used to mark boundaries, not the aggressive roar that preceded confrontation, but something entirely different. It was a sound that seemed to contain layers of meaning, complexity that human ears struggled to process. Researchers later described it as a symphony of communication, a single vocalization that carried information to every lion within a 50-kilometer radius. It was the first sound Thorn had made in 3 years, and it changed everything. The roar was answered, not by one lion, but by dozens. From the north, the east, the south, and the west, lions began to vocalize in response to Thorn's call. The Iron Mane Brotherhood roared from their territory. The royal bloodline answered from the south. Nomadic males who had been traveling through the region emerged from the darkness and added their voices to the chorus. It was as if Thorn's call had awakened something dormant in the territorial structure of the entire region. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for all the pieces to align, waiting for the perfect time to reveal the full extent of what he had become. Dr. Webb was in the main research station when the roaring began. His account of what happened next is one of the most detailed records we have of the events of that night. He immediately woke the other researchers and directed them to activate every camera, every monitoring device, every piece of equipment they had. By the time the staff had fully mobilized, the savannah was alive with the sounds of roaring lions, dozens of them, all seemingly responding to Thorn's initial call. Webb's voice on the radio transmissions from that night carries an unmistakable note of awe, mixed with something approaching fear. "We have a convergence event," Webb reported to the Central Research Headquarters. "Multiple territorial coalitions are moving toward a central location. All indicators suggest they are being drawn by the solitary male we have been monitoring. I cannot explain what is happening, but something unprecedented is occurring on the Serengeti tonight. All personnel should prepare for the possibility of large-scale confrontation." By 12:30 a.m. on November 22nd, the convergence had become visually apparent. From the various camera trap positions that dotted the landscape, footage showed multiple groups of lions moving through the darkness, all heading toward the same general location. The movement was not chaotic or random. It was organized, coordinated, as if each group had received specific instructions about where to go and when to arrive. Some groups moved quickly, their powerful bodies striding through the grass with purpose. Others moved slowly, methodically, as if pacing themselves for something they knew would demand their full attention and strength. The location that all the lions were converging toward was a vast open plain that stretched between the northern and southern territories. It was a place that had no specific resources, no waterhole, no prey concentration that would naturally draw such numbers. It was simply an empty space, a blank canvas waiting for something to be written upon it. And at the center of that plain, visible in the darkness through the thermal imaging cameras the research teams had deployed, stood a single lion, Thorn, waiting for them, his body completely still, his silence absolute in the midst of the chaos of roaring voices. By 1 a.m., over 40 lions had arrived at the convergence point. The numbers were extraordinary. In normal circumstances, you might see coalitions of 3 to 5 males, prides of 8 to 12 females, and cubs, perhaps the occasional nomadic male passing through. But this was something entirely different. This was an assembly of predators that seemed to span the entire regional population, and they had all come in response to the silence of a single male who had spent 3 years learning patience, strategy, and the terrifying power that comes from understanding the rules of society well enough to transcend them entirely. The night of November 21st, transitioning into November 22nd, was not a night of violence in the traditional sense. It was something far more significant. It was a night of revelation, a moment when Thorn revealed the true nature of his intentions. As the lions gathered, forming what witnesses described as concentric circles around Thorn's position, he finally moved. He walked slowly toward the Iron Mane Brotherhood, the 3 males who had previously ruled the Northern Territories unchallenged. Obsidian, The eldest and most powerful of the three stepped forward to meet him. What happened next was captured in stunning clarity by the thermal imaging equipment and the high-speed cameras that the research teams had positioned at crucial angles. There was no roaring, no aggressive display. Thorn simply approached Obsidian, and the two males stood face to face, their eyes locked in a gaze that seemed to last an eternity, but was probably no more than 30 seconds. Then Thorn turned, and in a display of physical dominance that would become legendary in animal behavior circles, he walked directly into the center of the assembly. The assembled lions parted before him, creating a pathway as he moved through their midst. Some showed submission, their bodies lowering, their ears pinned back. Others simply stepped aside, apparently understanding without words that they were witnessing something that transcended normal territorial hierarchy. At the center of the assembly, Thorn finally stopped. He was now surrounded by the most powerful predators in the entire region, each one capable of killing him if they had coordinated their efforts. Yet none moved against him. Instead, they simply watched, as if waiting to understand what Thorn's next move would be. What happened in the hours between 1 a.m. and dawn on November 22nd remains one of the most debated sequences in wildlife behavioral science. The camera footage from that period shows remarkable images. Lions that had been territorial enemies standing peacefully near one another, coalitions that had been engaged in active conflict resting alongside the groups they had been fighting. It was as if Thorn's presence, his authority, his demonstrated mastery had somehow transcended the normal aggressive hierarchies that governed lion society. Dr. Webb's field notes from that night contain passages that read almost like poetry. So overwhelming was his attempt to capture what he was witnessing. Midnight has passed, and I am watching something that should not be possible. Over 40 lions from at least 8 separate groups have gathered in a single location, apparently in response to one male's call. There is no fighting. There is no typical aggressive display. Instead, there is order, hierarchy, a recognition of authority that appears to be complete and absolute. Is this the emergence of a new type of lion society? Is this the natural evolution of a species pushing itself toward greater complexity? I do not have answers to these questions. I only have observations of something so remarkable that it might change everything we thought we understood about these animals. As dawn approached on November 22nd, the assembled lions began to disperse, but they did not return to their territories in the same configuration they had arrived. Instead, they moved in coordinated groups, some moving north, some south, some to the east and west. It was as if Thorn had reorganized the entire territorial structure of the region in a single night, as if he had rewritten the social hierarchy through nothing but the force of his presence and the demonstrated power of his intellect. Thorn himself remained in the center of the plain as the sun rose, his golden coat catching the first rays of light, his scarred body a testament to the journey he had taken to reach this moment. He stood watching the groups depart, his expression unreadable, his silence maintained even as the chaos of the night transformed into the quiet of dawn. The savannah had changed, the predatory ecosystem had shifted on its foundations, and it had all occurred because one lion had chosen patience over aggression, silence over roaring, strategy over random violence. The implications of that night would occupy researchers for years to come. Thorn had not become the dominant lion through traditional methods. He had not fought and defeated every rival through superior strength or combat skills. Instead, he had evolved beyond those primitive methods. He had learned to manipulate social structures, to influence the behavior of others without overt aggression, to command respect through demonstrated intelligence rather than through raw power. He had transcended the limitations of his species and created something new, something unprecedented. In the days following the convergence event, Thorn's behavior returned to its previous quiet patterns. He hunted, he rested, he moved through his territories with the same calm deliberation that had characterized his life for the past 3 years. But everything had changed. The other males in the region no longer mocked him. The territories had reorganized themselves around his authority, and most importantly, Thorn had proven something that would forever alter how scientists understood animal behavior and animal intelligence. The silence was not weakness, it was power. The waiting was not submission, it was preparation. And the night that changed everything had been earned through 3 years of patience, 3 years of learning, 3 years of strategic positioning that had culminated in a display of dominance more complete and more permanent than anything that could have been achieved through violence. The aftermath of the convergence event revealed layers of complexity in what Thorn had accomplished that extended far beyond the simple reorganization of territorial hierarchies. In the weeks following November 22nd, the research teams began to piece together the full scope of his strategy, and what they discovered suggested that Thorn's planning had been far more elaborate and far-reaching than anyone had initially understood. This was not a spontaneous display of dominance, but rather the culmination of a meticulously calculated campaign that had been in motion since Thorn first arrived in the northern Serengeti 3 years earlier. Dr. Webb and his team began conducting detailed analysis of Thorn's movement patterns, cross-referencing his location data with the movements of every other lion in the region. What emerged was a map of extraordinary sophistication. Thorn had positioned himself not randomly, but in specific locations at specific times, each movement designed to influence the behavior of rival groups in subtle but significant ways. He had created situations where competing coalitions would encounter each other in ways that favored his long-term territorial goals. He had positioned kills to be discovered by groups he wanted to strengthen. He had left unmarked territories at precise moments to test which males would try to claim them, thereby identifying which animals posed threats and which could be safely ignored. The research revealed that Thorn had actually been conducting what could only be described as a census of the entire regional lion population. He had tracked every coalition, every pride, every nomadic male within a 100-kilometer radius. He had learned their movement patterns, their hunting strategies, their social hierarchies, their vulnerabilities. He had essentially created a comprehensive database of every significant player in the territorial structure of the northern Serengeti. This information had allowed him to calculate with remarkable accuracy what would happen if he called them all together. He had known exactly which groups would arrive at the convergence point, in what order they would arrive, and how they would be likely to respond to his presence. More remarkably, the research teams discovered evidence that Thorn had been deliberately manipulating prey animal movements to create situations that would force other lions into interactions with each other. By positioning kills in specific locations, by hunting in patterns that disrupted normal prey movement corridors, by essentially orchestrating the landscape itself, Thorn had created circumstances where rival groups would be brought into proximity with one another. This forced interaction had resulted in skirmishes and disputes that Thorn had then been able to mediate and resolve, thereby establishing himself as a power broker and a figure of authority. Thorn has essentially been playing three-dimensional chess with the entire territorial structure of the northern Serengeti. Dr. Pufor commented in one of the research seminars held 2 weeks after the convergence event. He has not just responded to situations as they arise, he has been deliberately creating situations designed to move the entire system toward a configuration that serves his interests. This suggests a level of forward planning and strategic thinking that we have never before documented in wild lions. We are watching the emergence of a new type of predatory intelligence. The implications of this realization began to spread through the scientific community with remarkable speed. Papers were written, conferences were organized, and universities began to debate the significance of what had been witnessed in the Serengeti. Some researchers argued that Thorn represented a potential evolutionary leap in feline intelligence. Others suggested that what had been observed was perhaps an anomaly, a single exceptional individual whose behaviors should not be interpreted as representative of the species as a whole. But the most conservative estimates still acknowledged that something significant had occurred, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal cognition and animal society. Meanwhile, in the territories themselves, the effects of Thorn's orchestration began to manifest in ways both obvious and subtle. The regions that had previously been characterized by constant territorial dispute and frequent violence became noticeably more stable. The reorganization that Thorn had implemented had apparently created a configuration that was more efficient and more sustainable than the previous random distribution of power. Prey animals, sensing the reduction in predatory violence and territorial conflicts, began to return to areas they had previously abandoned. The ecosystem itself seemed to stabilize and strengthen under the new arrangement. The three males of the Iron Mane Brotherhood, despite having been displaced from their position of supreme authority, actually seemed to benefit from the new structure. Rather than being eliminated or driven from their territories entirely, they found themselves positioned in areas that were rich in prey and relatively stable. They were no longer the supreme rulers, but they were survivors, and they retained status within the new hierarchy that Thorn had established. This suggested something remarkable about Thorn's approach to power. He was not interested in destruction for its own sake. He was interested in creating a sustainable system in which he held ultimate authority while allowing other groups to maintain viable positions within the larger structure. The royal bloodline, which had been struggling against the nomadic coalition from the east, found themselves in a dramatically improved position after the convergence event. The nomadic males, apparently understanding through some form of communication that confrontation with any of the groups now aligned with Thorn would be disastrous, chose to move their operations to distant territories. The royal bloodline inherited the best hunting grounds and the most productive territories, becoming one of the most powerful groups in the entire region. But everyone understood that their position was ultimately dependent on maintaining good relations with Thorn, the silent architect of this new world order. By early December, the territories had settled into a new configuration that was remarkably stable. Thorn maintained control of the central regions, the areas that provided the best water sources and the most reliable prey populations. The other groups occupied secondary territories arranged in a hierarchical pattern around Thorn's core domain. Communication between groups, rather than being conducted through violent territorial disputes, seemed to occur through a sophisticated system of scent marking and subtle behavioral displays. The entire regional system had essentially reorganized itself around the principle that conflict should be avoided through clear recognition of authority and the maintenance of strategic distance between competing groups. What fascinated Dr. Webb more than anything else was the fact that Thorn seemed completely uninterested in constantly reinforcing his dominance through displays of aggression or frequent confrontations. He maintained his authority through the mere fact of his presence and the understood knowledge that he possessed the intelligence and capability to move against any group that challenged his authority. It was the ultimate expression of power, the ability to command through perceived strength rather than through constant displays of violence. In many ways, Thorn was behaving like a king in the truest sense, governing through the consensus that his rule was inevitable and that challenging him would be futile and catastrophic. The turning point in how the scientific community understood Thorn's significance came in mid-December, when Dr. Webb made a discovery that suggested Thorn's intelligence extended even further than previously understood. While analyzing movement patterns, Webb noticed that Thorn had been deliberately leaving specific prey animals alive in certain territories. These were animals that possessed qualities that would make them valuable for establishing or maintaining pride populations. By essentially curating which animals lived and died in specific territories, Thorn was influencing the genetic composition and the breeding success of the various pride groups within his domain. Thorn is not just managing territory, Webb wrote in his most significant paper on the subject. He is managing genetics. He is essentially functioning as a breeding program administrator, determining which animals reproduce and which do not, thereby influencing the characteristics of the lion populations across the entire region. This is eugenics on a scale, and with a sophistication that we typically associate only with human civilization. Thorn has evolved beyond the simple territorial instincts of his species. He has become something more, something that operates at the level of ecosystem management and population control. The practical implications of this realization were staggering. If Thorn could indeed manage the breeding patterns of other lions through the manipulation of prey animals and territorial boundaries, then he possessed the ability to shape the future composition of the entire population. He could theoretically create a situation where his offspring inherited territories and resources that would make them more successful than other lions. He could influence the gene pool of rival groups to his advantage. He could essentially script the future of the northern Serengeti's lions for generations to come. In January of the following year, approximately 2 months after the convergence event, researchers documented Thorn interacting with several lionesses from the royal bloodline pride. The interaction was remarkable not for any unusual aggression or behavior, but rather for its complete normalcy. Thorn mated with the females, his behavior identical to that of any other breeding male. But the significance lay in what this represented. By breeding with the lionesses of the royal bloodline, Thorn was ensuring that his genetics would be passed on to one of the most successful pride groups in the region. His offspring would inherit territories that Thorn had carefully positioned to be among the most productive in the entire area. His bloodline would become dominant not through competition and displacement of existing populations, but through genetic infiltration and strategic breeding. The ranger stations buzzed with speculation about what this might mean for the future. Some researchers suggested that Thorn represented the emergence of a new evolutionary strategy, one in which predators competed not primarily through direct physical confrontation, but through the intelligent manipulation of social structures and genetic systems. Others wondered if this was merely the behavior of an exceptionally intelligent individual, an anomaly that would not be replicated or sustained beyond Thorn's own lifetime. What no one could deny, however, was that Thorn had fundamentally altered the nature of lion society in the northern Serengeti. He had taken a system characterized by constant violence and territorial dispute and transformed it into something more organized, more stable, and more efficient. And he had done all of this while maintaining almost perfect silence, speaking through action and presence rather than through roaring declarations of dominance. As the dry season progressed and the savannah became increasingly harsh, the benefits of Thorn's reorganization became even more apparent. The territories that he had established were proving to be far more resilient in the face of scarcity than the previous configuration had been. Groups that had previously starved during the dry season now found themselves with access to water sources and prey populations that sustained them. The overall mortality rate of lions in the region decreased significantly. The breeding success of females improved. Everything pointed toward a system that was not just politically reorganized, but genuinely optimized for survival and reproduction. By March, as the dry season reached its peak, Dr. Webb made the most significant observation of all. He documented Thorn actively sharing kills with other groups during a period of extreme scarcity. The lion made kills in his primary territories and left them in locations where other coalitions could access them. This was extraordinarily unusual behavior. Lions are not typically cooperative across pride boundaries except during very specific circumstances. Yet here was Thorn, deliberately providing food to groups that might otherwise have starved, maintaining the stability of his created system through active support and resource sharing. "I believe I am witnessing the emergence of a new type of lion society," Webb wrote in his field journal during this period. "Not the simple dominance hierarchies we have previously observed, but something approaching a genuine political system. Thorn is functioning as both a monarch and a steward, maintaining his authority while also taking responsibility for the welfare of the groups beneath him. The other lions appear to accept his authority not out of fear, but out of a genuine understanding that his rule benefits them. This is civilization. This is politics at the highest level. This is a demonstration of intelligence and strategic thinking that fundamentally challenges our assumptions about what lions are capable of." The implications of Thorn's actions extended far beyond the territories of the northern Serengeti. News of the convergence event and the subsequent reorganization spread through wildlife research communities around the world. Scientists who had spent their entire careers studying animal behavior found themselves grappling with the fundamental question of what intelligence meant, what society meant, what the boundaries of animal cognition actually were. Some of the more radical researchers began to suggest that perhaps Thorn represented not an anomaly, but an indication of latent capabilities that existed throughout the lion population, capabilities that had simply never been triggered or developed in the same way. If one lion could achieve this level of sophistication through 3 years of focused learning and strategic development, perhaps other lions possessed similar potential. Perhaps the difference between the animals we knew and a new, more sophisticated version of those animals was simply a matter of circumstances aligning in a way that allowed latent intelligence to blossom. The more conservative members of the scientific community resisted these interpretations, arguing that Thorn remained an exceptional case and that drawing broader conclusions from his behavior would be premature and potentially misleading. The debate became heated in academic circles, with papers and counter-arguments flying back and forth in journals and at conferences. But regardless of the scientific debate about what Thorn's behavior meant for our understanding of animal intelligence, the practical reality was undeniable. In the northern Serengeti, a new order had been established, violence had been reduced, stability had been achieved, and the overall welfare of the lion population had demonstrably improved. Thorn had written a new chapter in the story of lion society, and that chapter would influence how researchers understood predatory animals for decades to come. By the middle of the dry season, Thorn had established himself so completely as the organizing force of the regional lion society that his authority seemed almost unquestionable. Other males who had previously mocked him now deferred to him without hesitation. The royal bloodline lionesses who were bearing his offspring became some of the most respected females in the pride, their status elevated by their connection to the region's supreme authority. The territories he had created were functioning as he had apparently intended, with each group occupying a niche that maximized their individual success while maintaining the overall stability of the system. Yet Thorn himself remained characteristically silent. He did not revel in his success. He did not engage in the constant territorial displays and roaring challenges that other dominant males might have employed to reinforce their position. Instead, he moved through his territories with the same quiet purpose that had characterized his entire life, hunting when necessary, breeding when opportunities presented themselves, and occasionally engaging with the other groups in ways that maintained the stability and integrity of the system he had created. The rangers and researchers who monitored him noted that Thorn seemed to have entered a new phase of his life, one in which the struggle for dominance was essentially complete, and now he was focused on maintenance and optimization. He had achieved his goal of establishing himself as the supreme authority in the region. Now he was focused on ensuring that the system he had created would endure, and that his legacy would be one of order and intelligence rather than of violence and chaos. What would happen next, how Thorn's legacy would develop, and whether his achievements would be sustained beyond his own lifetime remained to be seen. But what was absolutely clear was that the Silence's lion had fundamentally changed the nature of lion society in the northern Serengeti. He had taken the mocking he had endured for 3 years and transformed it into motivation for something far greater. He had proven that in the animal kingdom, just as in human society, true power often lies not in the loudest voice, but in the one who understands the rules well enough to transcend them entirely. The nightfall of November 21st had changed everything, and the savannah would never be the same. The months following the dry season brought a transformation to the northern Serengeti that extended far beyond the simple reorganization of territorial boundaries. As the rains returned and the landscape transformed from golden and sparse to lush and abundant, the ecosystem that Thorn had restructured began to reveal its true potential. The stability he had imposed created conditions for unprecedented growth, reproduction, and ecological recovery. But more importantly, it created conditions for a fundamental shift in how lion society operated across the entire region. By mid-year, approximately 7 months after the convergence event that had established Thorn's dominance, the first generation of his direct offspring began to approach maturity. These were the cubs born to the lionesses of the royal bloodline and other prides with which Thorn had bred. The cubs were not only genetically superior due to Thorn's physical prowess, but they had been born into territories that were rich in resources and stable in their structure. They had grown up without the constant fear of territorial disputes and predatory violence that typically characterized a young lion's development. They represented something entirely new in the northern Serengeti, a generation of lions that would come of age under unprecedented conditions of security and abundance. The ranger stations became obsessed with monitoring these cubs, knowing that their development would provide crucial insights into how environment and genetics combined to shape animal behavior and capability. What they discovered was both remarkable and somewhat unsettling. The cubs displayed an unusual intelligence and behavioral sophistication from very early ages. They learned hunting strategies more quickly than normal cubs. They developed social skills and communication abilities that seemed more advanced than typical. Most remarkably, they seemed to inherently understand the hierarchical structure that Thorn had created, never challenging authority and always deferring to the established dominance system without requiring the harsh corrections that typically were necessary to teach such lessons. Dr. Webb, now in his 60s and one of the world's leading authorities on lion behavior, made an observation in one of his published papers that would become one of the most cited statements in wildlife behavioral science. We are witnessing the emergence of a new subspecies, not through the slow grinding mechanisms of natural selection across thousands of years, but through the rapid reorganization of social structures and the deliberate breeding programs of a single individual intelligence. Thorn has accomplished in a matter of months what natural evolution would typically require millennia to achieve. He has created a population of lions that are not just physically superior, but behaviorally and intelligently advanced. If this continues, if these cubs successfully breed and pass on these characteristics, we may be looking at the emergence of a genuinely new type of lion. The implications of this statement rippled through the scientific community. Some researchers celebrated it as confirmation of their theories about animal intelligence and the potential for rapid evolutionary change through social reorganization. Others criticized it as sensationalism and an overinterpretation of what was ultimately still just lions engaging in normal breeding behaviors. But the debate itself suggested how significant Thorn's impact had become. He was no longer just a lion engaging in unusual behavior. He had become a symbol, a representation of what was possible when intelligence combined with the power to reshape social structures. By the middle of the year, another significant development began to emerge. Thorn had started to visibly age. The scars that had always marked his body seemed to deepen. His movements, while still efficient and purposeful, no longer possessed the explosive power they once had. The physical toll of 3 years of intense strategic activity, combined with the natural aging process of a mature male lion, was beginning to show. He was still powerful, still commanding absolute authority, still the center around which the entire regional system rotated. But there was an undeniable sense that the peak of his physical power was passing. The research teams began to speculate about what would happen when Thorn eventually died or became too weakened to maintain his position. Would the system he had created survive his passing? Would his offspring attempt to maintain the order he had established, or would they revert to more traditional competitive behaviors? Would the other groups attempt to reorganize the territory for their own benefit, or would the precedent Thorn had set prove strong enough to sustain itself even in his absence? These questions became the focus of intensive research and theoretical discussion. Some scientists argued that Thorn's system was fundamentally dependent on his personal presence and intelligence, and therefore would collapse when he was no longer there to maintain it. Others suggested that he had created something so fundamentally stable and mutually beneficial that other lions would maintain it voluntarily because they would recognize its advantages. Still others theorized that Thorn's descendants, having been born into this system and raised within it, would have internalized its structures so completely that they would maintain them as a matter of instinct rather than conscious choice. What no one could predict with certainty was what would actually happen. The experiment that Thorn had initiated was still ongoing, still unfolding, and its ultimate outcome remained to be determined by circumstances and choices that had not yet occurred. As the rainy season progressed and the landscape continued its lush recovery, Thorn began to spend more time at rest, conserving his energy rather than expending it on constant patrol and monitoring. This was entirely rational behavior for an aging male, but it had profound implications for the territorial system he had created. As Thorn became less visible and less active, the other groups seemed to test the boundaries of his authority more frequently. Coalition males would move into territories that had been clearly marked as Thorn's domain, and then withdraw when they sensed his awareness of their presence. It was as if they were testing whether his authority was weakening, whether the moment might be approaching when his control could be challenged. Thorn responded to these tests with characteristic intelligence rather than explosive violence. When young males moved into his territory, he would position himself in ways that made his presence known without forcing direct confrontation. He would mark territories with particular intensity, leaving scent signals that communicated his continued claim and his willingness to defend that claim. He would make selective kills in territories where challenging males were operating, essentially reminding them of his predatory capability and his control over the food sources they depended on. In short, he was managing the decline of his physical power in ways that maintained his authority even as his ability to enforce that authority through direct combat diminished. By September, approximately 10 months after the convergence event, the seasonal drought that characterizes the African savannah had returned once again. The rains retreated, the landscape began to dry, and water sources that had been abundant during the wetter months began to dwindle. It was during this period of scarcity that the true test of Thorn's system would come. Under conditions of severe resource limitation, would the lions of the northern Serengeti maintain the orderly system that Thorn had created, or would scarcity trigger the ancient competitive instincts that had characterized lion society before his intervention? The answer came more quickly than anyone expected. As the drought deepened and prey animals migrated to more water-rich regions, a coalition from a distant territory, apparently unaware of or unconcerned with Thorn's authority, moved into the central regions of the northern Serengeti. These were 3 powerful males, young and aggressive, who had clearly never experienced Thorn's demonstrated capability or the psychological impact of his presence. They began to hunt in Thorn's primary territory, making kills and challenging the stability of the system. The first indication of Thorn's response came when prey animals in that territory essentially disappeared. The invading coalition found their hunting grounds emptied, apparently through Thorn's deliberate manipulation of prey animal movements. Without food in their claimed territory, the invading males would be forced to either move on or venture into other territories where they would face resistance from the organized groups that Thorn had positioned throughout the region. When the invading males attempted to move into the territory of the Iron Mane Brotherhood, seeking food and attempting to establish themselves as new regional players, they encountered immediate and overwhelming resistance. The Iron Mane Brotherhood, apparently understanding that any successful challenge to the territorial system that Thorn had created would destabilize the entire arrangement and threaten their own position, united with other groups to drive the intruders away. What happened over the course of 3 days in late September was a remarkable demonstration of how thoroughly Thorn had rewired the social structure of the region. Rather than each group attempting to take advantage of the invaders for their own territorial gain, the various coalitions and prides seemed to coordinate their actions, working together to remove the threat to the established system. The invading males, finding themselves not just opposed by one or two rivals, but by what appeared to be an organized alliance of the entire regional lion population, chose discretion and retreated to distant territories where they could operate without triggering the coordinated response that any attempted incursion into the northern Serengeti now provoked. Dr. Webb watched this sequence of events unfold through the camera feeds and field reports with growing amazement. "What we are witnessing," he wrote in his field journal, "is the emergence of something unprecedented in the animal kingdom. The various groups that Thorn organized have now begun to maintain the system voluntarily, without his constant active involvement. They are defending the territorial arrangement, not because Thorn is forcing them to, but because they have come to understand that the system serves their interests." The invading coalition was repelled not by Thorn, but by the collective action of groups that understood their own welfare was dependent on maintaining the stability of the larger structure. As the dry season intensified and the resource scarcity became more severe, Thorn's position evolved once again. Rather than hoarding resources or using his control of prey animals to maintain absolute dominance, he began to systematically ensure that all groups within his system had access to minimum food requirements. He arranged kills in patterns that allowed each territory to have sustainable hunting. He managed waterhole access to prevent any group from monopolizing these crucial resources. In essence, he was functioning as a guarantor of the system's stability, understanding that the system's collapse would be catastrophic for everyone, including himself. By October, as the dry season reached its peak, something remarkable became apparent. The northern Serengeti, despite severe conditions that were causing significant mortality in lion populations in adjacent regions, was actually sustaining its population far better than would normally be expected. The organized distribution of resources that Thorn had implemented meant that no group was completely excluded from hunting grounds or water access. The overall result was a region where predatory animals, while certainly stressed by the scarcity, were not suffering the catastrophic losses that were occurring in areas where lions still operated under the old competitive regime. News of this disparity began to spread through research communities and conservation networks. Researchers from other regions came to the Serengeti specifically to document Thorn's system and to understand how he had achieved what amounted to a revolution in predatory animal management. Some conservation scientists began to theorize that if similar organizational principles could be understood and perhaps even facilitated in other regions, it might be possible to improve the survival rates of endangered lion populations while simultaneously reducing human-lion conflicts that often resulted from desperate predators driven to hunt near human settlements. The ethical implications of this possibility generated intense debate. Could conservation scientists ethically attempt to manipulate lion social structures in ways designed to create Thorn-like leaders? Would such manipulation constitute an inappropriate level of human interference with natural processes? Or was the alternative, allowing lion populations to continue declining and suffering under unsustainable competitive regimes, itself a form of interference with natural processes? The questions were complex and ultimately unanswerable from first principles alone. What became increasingly clear as the dry season progressed was that Thorn had created something that had genuine value, not just for the lions themselves, but for the entire ecosystem. Stable predatory populations meant more consistent pressure on prey animals, which prevented any single prey species from overwhelming the ecosystem. Reduced predatory violence meant fewer injuries and deaths among lions from causes other than natural predation and competition, which reduced overall ecological stress. The system was not perfect, but it was unquestionably more stable and more sustainable than the chaotic competitive regime that had preceded it. By late November, as the dry season finally began to break and the first rains approached, Thorn was visibly weakened. His body, once massive and powerful, had become lean and worn. The scars that marked his body seemed to have accumulated in those final months, evidence of the constant low-level competition he maintained to sustain his authority. He moved more slowly now, rested more frequently, and spent less time actively patrolling his territories. But his presence remained absolute. Other lions still deferred to him. His authority remained unquestioned, and the system that he had created continued to function smoothly in his reduced presence. The younger males of Thorn's generation, recognizing that his time of active dominance was drawing to a close, began to position themselves for succession, but something remarkable occurred. Rather than attempting to challenge him directly or to seize power through aggressive confrontation, the most intelligent and strategically capable of these younger males began to work within the system that Thorn had created. They positioned themselves as lieutenants, as enforcers of his rules, as administrators of the structure he had established. In essence, they were preparing to inherit not just his territory, but his role as the organizing intelligence of the regional system. The most promising of these potential successors was a young male identified by the Rangers as Echo, so named because he seemed to mirror and replicate Thorn's behavioral patterns. Echo was one of Thorn's offspring, but he had been born to one of the distant prides and raised in a territory adjacent to Thorn's central domain. Through careful observation and strategic positioning, Echo had managed to insinuate himself into the regional power structure. He began to make kills that he shared with other groups, following Thorn's model of resource management. He positioned himself as a mediator in disputes between rival coalitions. Most remarkably, he seemed to be preemptively establishing the authority structures that would be necessary to maintain the system when Thorn was no longer able to do so. When Thorn finally acknowledged Echo's rise, doing so through a series of subtle behavioral displays and strategic positioning, rather than through overt declaration, the transition of power began. Echo was not presented as a replacement for Thorn or as a rival challenger. Instead, he was positioned as Thorn's designated successor, the heir apparent to the system that Thorn had created. The other groups, recognizing the legitimacy of this transition and understanding that it was necessary for the system's continuity, accepted Echo's expanding role without resistance. By the time the Reigns fully returned in December, approximately 13 months after the convergence event that had established Thorn's dominance, the transition of power was essentially complete. Thorn still maintained nominal supreme authority, and other lions still deferred to him, but the day-to-day management of the regional system had shifted to Echo and a small cadre of younger males who had been trained in Thorn's methods and who understood the principles that underlay his system. The research teams watched this transition with fascination, documenting every aspect of how power was transferred without violence, without confrontation, without the chaos that typically accompanied shifts in predatory hierarchies. It was as if Thorn had somehow encoded his understanding of governance and system management into the behaviors and beliefs of the next generation, creating a continuity of authority that would persist even after his individual passing. In January, as the new year began, and the landscape transformed once again under the influence of abundant rainfall, Thorn withdrew almost entirely from active territorial management. He spent his days resting in the cooler parts of the day, hunting only when he felt inclined, and generally allowing Echo and the other younger males to manage the day-to-day operations of the system. His role had evolved from active administrator to figurehead and symbol, from the force maintaining the system through personal dominance to the embodiment of the principles that the system represented. The final months of Thorn's life, which would extend into the following year but which seemed to be approaching their inevitable conclusion, became a period of remarkable documentation and study. Scientists from around the world came to the Serengeti specifically to observe the aging lion who had revolutionized predatory animal society. His behavior during this period revealed a level of acceptance and philosophical resignation that was almost poignant in its completeness. He had achieved everything he set out to achieve. He had created a system that functioned smoothly and that was being successfully transferred to the next generation. He had left a legacy that would extend far beyond his own lifetime. The story of Thorn became one of the most significant cases in animal behavioral science, cited in textbooks and studied in universities around the world. His journey from mocked and ridiculed outcast to the architect of a revolutionary new form of predatory society represented something profound about intelligence, adaptation, and the capacity of individuals to transcend the limitations of their species' typical behaviors. But perhaps more importantly, the story of Thorn represented a lesson that extended far beyond animal behavior. It was a story about the power of patience, the value of silence, and the transformative potential of strategic thinking. It was a reminder that true power often lies not in the loudest voice or the most aggressive display, who possesses the intelligence to see possibilities that others cannot perceive, and who has the patience to wait for the moment when all the pieces align. The nightfall of November 21st had indeed changed everything, but the changes Thorn had set in motion would continue to ripple outward for years to come, influencing how lions lived and organized themselves, influencing how researchers understood animal intelligence and animal society, and influencing how humans thought about the potential for radical transformation through intelligent adaptation and strategic vision. In the end, the story of Thorn was not just about a lion who mocked his silence. It was about an animal who understood that silence, properly employed, could be more powerful than any roar. It was about an individual who recognized that the greatest victories were not those won through violence and domination, but those achieved through intelligence, patience, and the creation of systems that benefited everyone within them. As the rains continued to fall on the Serengeti and the ecosystem thrived under the stable conditions that Thorn's system had created, it became clear that his legacy would endure. The northern territories would continue to function according to his principles long after his physical form had returned to the dust of the African savannah. Echo and his successors would carry forward the traditions he had established, not out of mindless imitation, but out of genuine understanding of why the system worked and how its principles could be applied to new situations and new challenges. The mocking had ceased long ago, the silence had been transformed into legend, and the quiet lion who had chosen patience over aggression had become one of the most significant figures in the history of predatory animal society. This is what happens when you refuse to respond to the taunts of those who do not understand. This is what becomes possible when you invest time in observation and learning, rather than in constant displays of aggression. This is the power of the lion who understood that nightfall, when the world grows quiet and the true nature of things is revealed, could change everything. And it did.